Today we are privileged to be joined by Nouriel Roubini, one of the world's most respected and insightful economists and societal analysts. Nouriel is a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, chairman of Roubini Macro Associates, and has been previously named by Foreign Policy magazine as number 4 of the world's top 100 thinkers. Perhaps best known for predicting the 2008 housing crash that initiated the Great Recession, he held many positions at the core of global policymaking, including chief economist for the Clinton White House's Council on Economic Affairs. And most excitingly to me, he is an advisor to the Global Partnership for Civic Engagement. Nouriel, welcome to the series.
Hi, great being with you today, Jim.
Thank you. The audience and myself are very pleased to have you kick off the program. So let's dive right in. You have argued that a so-called perfect storm of 10 deadly disruptions is brewing that threatens our collective future, at least for the coming decade. I'd like to discuss with you each one of these in more detail. And after, at the end, I'd like to ask you 2 more general and more hopeful questions.
It'd be great. Yeah, that's the topic of my new book. Is 10 deadly deeds.
Read it.
Yeah,
and I hope all the audience does as well. So let's start out with the first one. These 10 deadly disruptions. The first one you describe as debt and deficits leading to defaults. Tell us more about that.
Well, what has happened is that if you look at the data about levels of debt, and by that I imply both private debt and public debt. Public debt is the debt of the governments. Private debt is the debt of households, of non-financial corporations, and of financial institutions like banks and shadow banks. If you look at the trends over time, for the last 20, 30 years, they've been rising, both in advanced economies and in emerging markets. And just between last year or 2019, where the debt ratio globally was about 320% of GDP, because of the COVID crisis and accumulation of further debt, private and public, that ratio right now is estimated to be already now at 365% of GDP. And in a couple of years, it's going to be 400% of GDP. Now, what's the absolute level of debt that becomes unsustainable, that leads then to either a default or a debt restructuring or a financial crisis? We don't know. It depends on many factors. And of course, there may be good reasons to borrow. If you borrow to invest into real assets like public and infrastructure that gives you a return greater than the cost of borrowing, maybe to borrow to invest into infrastructure like green economy or digitalization might be a good idea. But if you borrow to run budget deficits, if you borrow to spend and consume, then eventually your debt becomes unsustainable. And I think what's happened in the last 20, 30 years is that the large rise in debt ratios is driven by income and wealth inequality. We know the real income have stagnated. Median incomes in the US in real terms have been stagnant for the last 30 years. People have aspiration of spending and their incomes are not rising as much. And you want to keep up with the Joneses. So what has happened in the United States is that we had what people refer to as the democratization of finance. If I cannot spend because I don't have the income, I can borrow. And the manifestation of it was the global financial crisis of a decade ago, where people were borrowing money to buy homes in which they did not have much equity. That was pushing up the price of homes, creating an asset bubble. And of course, that house of cards went bust between 2007 and 2009, with an asset and credit bubble going into a bust and a crash. So we had an example of excessive debt leading to an economic and then a financial crisis, because people were essentially borrowing to buy homes without equity, and that they were using their homes as an ATM machine, withdrawing some equity to finance their consumption. And that ended up in blood and tears. More recently, the democratization of finance is now this new phenomenon of the day traders and the Robin Hood traders. These are lots of kids who are skillless, jobless, incomeless, wealthless, hopeless. And what they're doing, they're sitting at home, they don't have job, they don't have income, they don't have hope. They go and they have maybe a couple of $1,000 of savings, and they can leverage 5 times, 10 times, and they invest and they speculate in the stock market. So these things that these guys are a bunch of, how to say, of rebels who are trying to fight Wall Street is nonsense. Wall Street is duping them, and instead of having real jobs, real income, real skills, they think they can get rich quickly with a get rich quick schemes. But this bubble is feeding now, the stock market bubble is going to end up like the global financial crisis with a bust and a crash. So we have again another example of how we're creating with debt, asset and credit bubbles that eventually lead to financial crisis. So these are the kind of things I'm worried about.
Yeah. So, and we could do a whole show on that, but
yeah,
we're still in this pandemic right now. Governments are, running these extra deficits. They're not thinking so much about it. They're in the middle of a crisis. Do these governments have any alternative now to running up these? Is this one of those situations different from other times when it's a requirement?
Let's put it this way. I do agree that whenever you have a recession, like the global financial crisis or the recession triggered by COVID, the risk is that this recession becomes a depression, because if the private sector, household and firms are not spending, then the recession can become more severe. And therefore, both the monetary authority by printing money and easing interest rates, and the fiscal authority by spending more, taxing less, transferring and bailing out illiquid but solvent agents, have a role to prevent a greater recession from becoming a greater depression. But there is no free lunch here. The buildup of debt of the public sector is huge. And we don't know whether the money will end is going to be to firms and households that are illiquid but solvent, as opposed to zombie firms that are going to be insolvent. And then the burden goes of bailing out the private sector on the back of the public sector. What we know is that there is a huge buildup, even before this crisis, of private and public debt, domestic and foreign debt, household, corporate, banks, non-banks, governments, you name it. And that eventually is not sustainable. And we have decided that since we have a recession, the right thing to do, it might be, is to have a fiscal stimulus to prevent a depression from occurring. But if we do the stimulus now, we have to have a plan for fiscal consolidation over time, because if we don't have a plan for fiscal consolidation, eventually these debts are going to become unsustainable. Now, in countries like US and Europe, where you can borrow in your own currency, unlike emerging markets that have to default when they borrow in a foreign currency, you can always monetize your fiscal deficit. You can essentially have the central bank buying your debt, and therefore you don't have to formally default. But monetization of deficit, as I discussed in one of the other chapters of my book, can eventually cause inflation that wipes out, again, the real value of the debt. It's a form of taxation of wealth, of savings, of creditors. So whether you do it with debt monetization or default, eventually a debt that becomes unsustainable has to be addressed. And I worry that while we need a stimulus, and I'm all in favor of it, we don't have a plan to reduce our debt and deficit over time. And every time there's a problem, we do more debt, more deficit, and we are kicking the can down the road. And we're not resolving the fundamental problem of why growth is low, that have nothing to do with having more debt or less debt. The fundamental problem of why our economies are unequal, they're not growing fast enough, and we have a large amount of income and wealth inequality.
So speaking of personal spending, it seems to me that you could have a global situation in addition to the typical economic factors of recovery for individuals, where this was quite a surprise to people, more than most, by definition, a once in a century kind of event. And could it be possible that consumers, in addition to the normal reticence to spend freely after a recession, some of them might be even more reticent because they are now spooked by the idea that unexpected things can happen? And this is a global phenomenon. Could that be an additional factor?
Yes, one of the reasons why you spend less and save more is because you don't have as much income, and therefore you have to save it. And if you have a lot of debt, then you are also in trouble. But then there could be an additional, as you point out, precautionary savings. You don't know whether you'll have a job tomorrow or whether you're going to be fired again, or whether
I
you're
mean,
going to
people have always
have a
saved
job with
for a
income.
rainy day. This is quite a
Yeah.
rainy day, you know.
Yeah. So some of it is rainy day savings, so it's precautionary. You should do it. Of course, what's individually rational, when I have a trouble with my income and I have a lot of debt, I should spend less, save more to reduce my debt. In the aggregate, can lead a recession to become deeper. That's what Keynes referred to as the paradox of thrift. Thrift is good individually. It's better to spend less, save more, reduce your debts or increase your assets. But if everybody spends less and save more, then a recession becomes a deeper recession. That's why we have to have a government that either spends in itself or transfers income, money, reduce taxes to private sector so they spend more, to avoid this paradox of thrift depression trap. So we need to backstop the system, but we're building up even more debt. So eventually, at some point, we have to pay back those debts, and we're not going to grow ourselves out of that problem because potential growth is low. So in the past, you could say growth is going to be 4, 5, 6%. Therefore, I can resolve the debt problem with growth, like after World War II. But we're not in that world. We're in a world in which, for lots of reasons, potential growth is very low.
Let's move on to the next one, which is demographic trends of aging. What do you think about this? Why is this such a threat?
It's a threat for the following reason. Reason number one is that the potential growth of any country depends on two factors. One is the growth of the labor force, and the other one is productivity growth. If you have aging of population, of course, the number of younger people who join the labor force shrinks compared to the number of people who are old and retired. And therefore, we know, and economic theory suggests, that your potential growth is lower when you have aging of population. So one of the problems we have right now in the world, of course, is that growth is low. And what I'm saying is aging. And aging is not just a problem in US. It's also a problem in Europe. It's a problem in Japan. In other advanced economies, also some emerging markets. China now is aging. Russia is aging. Korea is aging. So emerging market reaching per capita level of income that are middle class, they tend also to age. So that's a global phenomenon. A second aspect of it that's important is that in addition to the official debt of the US, the public debt right now is 25 trillion, about 100% of GDP, there are also implicit liabilities that come from aging. Because when you age, you have to pay pension for the pensioners, Social Security. But our Social Security system in US and globally is pay as you go, meaning the contribution of the young people working are funding the retirement of the old. But if there is less young people and more old people, then there is an implicit liability. Or our healthcare payment, like Medicare for the elderly, again, is pay as you go. As more people become older, the bill for healthcare for the elderly is going to burgeon. So we have an official debt that is formal debt. Public debt of the Treasury is already 100% of GDP, but economists like Larry Kotlikoff have estimated that the implicit liability coming from unfunded Social Security and healthcare system could be another 100 to 200% of GDP, that eventually we're going to run out of money to pay for our Social Security or Medicare. So either we tax
is this a global phenomenon at that level of implicit debt?
It is in advanced economies, because in advanced economies, whether it's US or Europe or Japan, we have aging of population, and most of these countries, with the exception of very few that have a funded social security system, most of them have a pay-as-you-go social security system. So yes, actually, the problem you could argue is even bigger in Europe or in Japan by some dimension, because aging is more severe. On the other side, in some European countries like Italy, they've done reforms to reduce the liability of the social security system. They've reduced, for example, benefits. But in US, as you know, social security, people say, is the third rail of US politics. Is taboo to think about either raising payroll taxes as a way of making the system viable, or reducing the benefit of the elderly. Because people say, I work all my life, I contributed, now you want to cut my benefits. So politically, we have done nothing. We had the problem with Social Security in the 80s with the commission, the Greenspan Commission, that led to some reform. But now we have another round of aging with the baby boomers retiring, and we're doing nothing. Nobody is even talking about reforming Social Security. So that's a time bomb.
Yeah. In a more global sense, not just in the US, throughout this crisis, you've seen governments providing direct payments to individuals or through businesses, and the standard of expectation has gone even higher during this crisis. Do you believe that there's a new normal of expectation about the social welfare state and what the standard is for care? And is there political pressure now underneath to raise that standard at even greater cost?
There is. In Europe, historically, the social welfare state was already very large. The government provides free education, free healthcare, generous unemployment benefits, disability, and so on. So government spending and revenue as a share of GDP for the average European country is already close to, say, 50% of GDP. In the US, you had more of a private sector provision of some things rather than public. So between federal and state and local government, the government size was less than 40% of GDP. And given where the problem of income not rising, in the US, we essentially in the past democratized finance. So we said, okay, you borrow to buy your home, or you borrow to cover other types of spending. And that led to an explosion of private debt rather than public debt as much. But in Europe, instead, where we had the social welfare state, instead of you borrowing in the private sector, the government borrows for you and provides you free services, and they don't pay for it because they don't tax you. So in the US was an explosion of private debt. In Europe was an explosion of public debt. But in the US right now, after the global financial crisis, and after people got busted by having too much debt, like mortgage debt, now the government has to do more of its share of providing transfer payment, reduced taxes, more benefits of one sort or another, or bailing out, like in this crisis, firms and households that are, unquote, illiquid but solvent. So I think that US is becoming gradually more like Europe. But there is a difference. In Europe, there is a willingness to spend more for the households and the business sector, but there's also a willingness to tax more. So you have high taxes and you have high spending. You still have budget deficit, but they're limited. In US, instead, we have the pressure to spend more and to backstop firms, households, and private sector, especially when things go wrong. But there is no political willingness to raise taxes because the middle class and the working class cannot afford it. And the political system is rigged with the upper income classes. They don't pay enough of income taxes, capital gains taxes, estate taxes, or wealth taxes. And therefore, the gap between the two is a large and growing amount of fiscal deficit. So we're becoming like Europe on the spending side. We're not becoming like Europe on the revenue side. And now we have an explosion of public debt. You know, US last year had the budget deficit close to 20% of GDP. This year is going to be probably at least another 20% of GDP. It's huge. It's eventually not sustainable.
And of course, underneath it all is the rising interest public in the average member of the public in universal basic income as a backstop for everything globally. And I think that has its own political momentum, which again will have to be interpreted and integrated given the debt crisis that you're talking about. So,
well, you know, with this stagnation of income, and eventually, as we'll discuss, AI leading to technological unemployment, we may need universal basic income. But I'll give you the following statistics. We did these checks for households in the spring, the CARE Act, only $1,000 for a month. The cost of it for 330 million Americans, what was it? About $330 billion for 1 month, $1,000. Suppose you want to give universal basic care of only $1,000 a month to everybody. And that's not lots of money. It's $12,000 a year, the spare change in the United States. That is going to cost you 330 times 12, about $4 trillion. $4 trillion today is 20% of GDP. Now, we say we want to finance it by taxing the rich. But, you know, you can soak the rich as much as you like. You can tax their wealth. You can tax their income, not at 39%, but 50 or 60 or 70. Raising $4 trillion of money is going to be mission impossible. So even a simple idea of only $1,000 a month per individual universal basic income costs you today 20% of GDP. No country can afford it. And borrowing against the future against it means you're going to bankrupt yourself. This level of borrowing just for one program, 20% of GDP, is going to lead to US bankruptcy in a matter of a few years.
Well,
so great idea. It's easy to talk about it. Who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, I wasn't saying necessarily it's feasible. I'm saying there's a rising pressure given these other issues we'll talk about. So the next issue that you bring up of your 10 is deflation and debt deflation.
Well, that issue is correlated to the first one. When you have a rise in debt, eventually this debt implies that people have a debt burden is not sustainable and they tend to spend less. And one of the reasons why growth has been weak is this lack of aggregate demand, deriving both by combination of too much debt and income and wealth inequality. Then when there is not enough aggregate demand compared to supply, what happens is you have deflation, and you've seen it in Japan, in Europe, but during the global financial crisis, you had inflation becoming negative. And even today, in most of the world, because of the COVID crisis, you have a slack in the goods market. Firms don't have pricing power. You have a slack in the labor market with high unemployment. Workers don't have wage bargaining power. You have commodity prices falling, and you have real estate also in large urban areas falling in price. So we're already heading towards deflation. Now, what does deflation do? Deflation increases the real value of your nominal debt. Suppose I have a, say, I'll give you an example. I have a mortgage debt of $100,000 and I pay, say, 3% interest on it. If my wage is, say, $100,000 a year, I can use some of my wages to pay for this mortgage debt over time. But suppose that prices fall and my wages are falling. So we have deflation, that is the fall in the price level and the fall in the wage level. Then if my income is not 100, but say 80, that's deflation. Wages have fallen. Then my real value of my debt is not anymore 100% of my income, but that debt ratio becomes 120% of my income. So you have the phenomenon that Fisher talked about, the deflation increases the real value of nominal debt and fixed nominal interest rates, and therefore makes the debt burden even more unsustainable. So in a world where there is deflation, the debt problems become even more exacerbated and the risk of default becomes bigger. Now, there are two types of deflation. There's one deflation is bad, and there's one deflation is good. The bad deflation is the one that comes from low aggregate demand. When there is less demand, income falls and the price level falls, but the price level fall is a signal of lack of demand, of weak economic activity, of less employment, of less jobs, less income. Then there is another type of deflation that comes from technological innovation. If you have an innovation that increases the production of goods and services, output is bigger, the price falls, but output is rising. While with the bad deflation, prices are falling because demand is falling and output is falling. Now there is a debate on how much of the deflation we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is a good deflation or bad deflation. After the GFC was bad deflation. After the COVID crisis was a bad deflation. It's a signal of lack of demand, low economic growth that leads to that deflation. Some people are hopeful, and that's a next chapter of my book, that technology, AI, robotic automation is going to lead to good deflation, meaning we increase the economic pie, we have more supply of goods and services, the price level falls, but we're all richer because we have greater purchasing power over cheaper goods. But we're not yet in that world. Now, the macro data don't suggest it. But in this chapter, I'm thinking about the consequences of that deflation.
Now, there have been societies that have had sustained deflationary periods. Given that the world now is in this COVID, post-COVID situation with a lot of this bad deflation, what has happened politically and economically in those societies when you have sustained bad deflation periods, not just economically, but politically and culturally?
Well, one example of bad deflation was, of course, what happened during the Great Depression, where the stock market shock, given the lack of the right response, led to recession. There became a depression, and during the depression, the price level was falling, wages were falling, and people went bankrupt. They defaulted on their mortgages, on their business loans, and you had massive bankruptcies of banks, 2,500 of them went out of business, of businesses and households. And you had this phenomenon. That's why Fisher in the 1930s cognated the term of debt deflation. That when you have a lot of debt and then you have a recession, the price level fall increases the real value of your debt and makes the debt problem even more unsustainable and leads to even more bankruptcies of governments, of countries, of households, of corporates, of banks. So the biggest example of bad deflation was the Great Depression, where unemployment was 25%, output fell 30%, prices were collapsing because there was not enough demand. And the fall in the price level was making the debt ratio even more unsustainable. Second example, of course, was Japan. After the collapse of the bubble in the 90s, we had 20 years of deflation and economic stagnation. We didn't have a depression, but we had what people refer to as a great stagnation of Japan. And the third example was after the global financial crisis. And the fourth one is what's happening right now. So these are all examples of an economic shock or a political shock or a financial shock leading to recession, deflation, weak economic activity, and debt deflation.
And in some of those periods, obviously, you had an attraction to authoritarianism and strongman leadership, and in others, you didn't.
Well, you know, during the Great Depression, as we know, the Great Depression led first to an economic crisis, then a financial crisis, then a collapse of economic activity, then trade wars that led to a collapse of foreign trade, then capital controls, then bankruptcies of firms, banks, and so on. And in some countries, that led, of course, to the rise of authoritarian, strong leaders like Hitler in Germany, or Mussolini in Italy, or Franco in Spain, or, of course, the authoritarian leaders of Japan. And then eventually the Great Depression led to World War II. So we know what are the consequences of severe economic financial crisis, populism of either extreme right or extreme left. Now, there were success stories like the US. The US, there was populism. US could have ended up like Germany and Italy. There were neo-Nazis, there were fascists in the United States. We got lucky that we elected FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They did a great deal. He decided enough austerity, enough of letting everybody liquidate and go bankrupt. That was the motto of Hoover and of Mellon that led to the Great Depression. And we did the New Deal. We decided to finally listen to John Maynard Keynes and do a massive monetary and fiscal stimulus to boost the economy and get us out of the Depression. But if we had not done it, the US could have ended up like Nazi Germany or fascist
Absolutely.
Italy. So the democracy that survived were those that actually did the policies to prevent the Great Depression from becoming even worse. While in Germany and Italy, you ended up with economic disaster and then political disaster, and then eventually we had World War II.
Let's talk now about debasement of fiat currencies. And then I want to move on to technology.
Well, debasement of fiat currency is in a world in which you have too much debt and deficit and become unsustainable. And then you have implicit liability coming from aging. And then you have debt deflation because the price level is falling because of aggregate demand. You need to do something. And the solution that has been chosen by central bank and fiscal authorities after the global financial crisis, and now is done to the power of 3, because what we did 10 years ago in 3 years now has been done in 3 months last year, is that you run a large fiscal deficit. And then since you have to issue debt, if you issue debt and you finance it with debt, interest rates go to the roof and then you have a crisis. So we told central banks, push the policy rate to 0. And then once it's at 0, it's not enough, go and buy the bonds that has been issued by the government and you monetize them by printing money. So literally you have a monetization of deficits and debt. That means that the debt ratios are high, but the financing cost, that is interest rate on the debt, is very low, because on the short hand, interest rates are either 0 or negative, like in Europe and Japan. And on the long end of the yield curve, interest rates are very low, say 1% in US today for 10-year treasury, while in Europe and Japan, interest rates on nominal debt at 10-year maturity is negative, between 0 and minus 0.6%. So we resolve the problem of debt by essentially debasing fiat currency, printing money. In the short run, printing money doesn't cause inflation. Why? Because we have a lack of demand relative to supply. Slack in goods market, slack in good labor market, slack in real estate, slack in commodities. So monetizing large deficit in the short run prevents deflation and lowflation, and maybe it's the right response. However, if you monetize large fiscal deficit and you have overhang of liquidity, two things happen. The first one is the money goes somewhere. And where does it go? Asset inflation. So we have a bubble in the GFC of real estate, and this time around a bubble in the stock market. But eventually, when you have too much money chasing too few goods, even goods inflation is going to rear its ugly head. It might not be a story for this year or next because we're still in a slack, but my view is that by 2023, monetizing large fiscal deficit leads to essentially risk of inflation rising, especially if we have some negative supply shocks. You remember in the 70s, we had two negative supply shocks, Yom Kippur War in 73, oil embargo, spike in oil prices, we monetized the deficit, we had double-digit inflation and recession. 1979, Iranian Revolution, spike in oil prices, we monetize the fiscal deficit, we get stagflation, inflation and recession. This time around is not going to be oil, the source of those negative supply shock, will be another source. This is my next chapter, is deglobalization, is protectionism, is balkanization of the global economy, is decoupling between US and China, is less technological innovation, is fragmentation, is reshoring. These are all things that reduce potential growth, increase the cost of production, and then they cause eventually stagflation. So the end game of monetization of deficit, if you have negative supply shock, is inflation or stagflation. That is inflation with recession like the 70s. That's one of the risks down the line.
Yeah. Now, to cover all these great topics, we're going to have to move ahead and move a little more quickly. So digital disruptions like AI that increase inequality. You mentioned them earlier as part of the good deflation scenario. And obviously, in many ways, technological innovation may get us out of some problems and offer great growth. So you call them, this is one of your deadly threats, these digital disruptions that increase inequality. Talk more about that.
Well, we know that eventually, we have not seen it in the macro data, but eventually technological innovation, AI, machine learning, robotic, automation, but also the various other industries of the future that are going to be related all to AI, big data, IoT, and technology, they're going to increase the economic pie. So maybe now potential growth in Europe is 1%, in US maybe less than 2%, but people say, don't worry, eventually the innovation is going to increase the pie and growth is going to be 3%, 4%, 5%. And we may even be able at that point to finance UBI. The problem with technology, however, is the economic pie may grow, even if the macro data so far don't suggest it. But then we know that technological innovation has the following feature. One is capital intensive. 2 is skill biased. 3 is labor saving. So if you own financial capital, real capital, and you buy the machines, the robots, you're going to do very well. If you're in the top 20% of distribution of skills, education, human capital, the machines and the algorithm can make you smarter and more productive and richer. But if you are a blue-collar worker and your jobs in a factory is going to be replaced by the robot, or if you are a white-collar worker, and many of the technology right now replace also white-collar jobs, right? I mean, suppose you have express checkouts. You don't need the cash tellers in a supermarket or in any store. You can just do it yourself. Or take autonomous vehicles. Today, you have millions of workers that are Uber drivers or truck drivers. 10 to 20 years from now, when we have autonomous vehicle, millions of Teamsters, truck driver without jobs, millions of Uber driver or Lyft drivers without jobs. That's the technological employment that comes from that. So it starts with manufacturing, but actually the disruptions of jobs can occur in retail, in transportation, in education, in government services, pretty much along the line. So it's not just blue-collar jobs, it's also white-collar jobs. And it's not only low-value added jobs, because now many jobs, even that require medium skills, like say, if you're an auditor that had an MBA in auditing, a machine can do the auditing of billions of transactions of a firm faster than any human being can do. They cannot go through billions of transactions. So increasingly more jobs, blue collar, white collar, low skill, but increasingly medium skill, get replaced by technology. And that increases inequality. And then we have a social problem and we have a political backlash, unless then we tax the winners that are those who own the capital and those who are the lucky ones who can use technology to increase their income, but we have to tax them big time to transfer money to those who are left behind. That might be UBI or maybe progressive taxation or maybe wealth taxation, but we're not yet there. So there may be a solution, but then even the solution, people want the dignity of work. Many were people who voted for Trump. They say, I don't want a welfare check. I want to have the dignity of a good job, in a good firm, in a good factory that gives me dignity to myself and my family. I don't want just a check. So UBI will be acceptable politically, as opposed to people say, I want a real job. That's an open question.
Yeah, as you know, I organized the 2015 World Summit on Technological Unemployment, and I care deeply about this issue. And I think it has almost all the issues discussed is one of the most problematic and complex, and I think will interact with every single one of these other issues. Now, on a related note, let's go global.
Yeah.
You cite as your sixth of the 10, deglobalization and decoupling of the world economy. All we've heard about for decades is this inevitable globalization. And now we're talking about deglobalization. What is that and how does it concern you?
Well, we reach a peak globalization already after the global financial crisis, where this financial crisis led to such a rise in unemployment that people started to blame foreign worker and migration, and started to blame trade, and started to blame globalization by saying that trade, globalization, migration is stealing my jobs, is bringing the jobs to China, abroad, or the bad hombres from Mexico, and so on and so on. So already we had seen that in many countries, there was less trade liberalization or imposition of tariffs. And of course, in countries where populist leaders like Trump were elected, you also had protectionism, and he started slapping tariff right and left. Or in the UK, you had the Conservatives and then Boris Johnson going for Brexit. This is a form of deglobalization, say, we don't want to be part of the free trading area of Europe. So essentially what happens is that there are forces that are powerful that lead to inequality. Some of them have to do with technology. Some of them have to do with globalization, trade, and migration. Now, trade, like technology, increases the economic pie. But even economics 1-to-1 says that when you liberalize trade, there are some winners. There are those in the export sector. There are some winners, that is every consumer can buy cheap goods from abroad. But then there are losers. The losers are those who have labor in import competing sector where the jobs and income disappear. And those losers are becoming huge because we had massive amount of, say, deindustrialization in the US, where millions of manufacturing jobs went to Asia, went to China, went to India, went to emerging markets. So we forgot when we liberalized trade that while in absolute the economic pie is bigger, then there are winners and there are losers. And what we offer to the losers, we said we're going to give you some trade assistance, some income, some retraining, but rightly so, the union said that trade adjustment assistance was a joke. It became trade burial assistance, right? These jobs were gone for good, and these workers were lost, and politically they had no power. And guess what? They started to become the Reagan Democrats and then the Trump Democrats, and they started to become highly populist and resent the foreigners, resent trade, resent China. So the bad hombres from Mexico are stealing my jobs, and the bad Chinese are also stealing my jobs by selling us cheap goods. So that was the backlash against trade, against globalization, against migration. That is a phenomenon. So we are seeing now, it started after the GFC, but now it's taken momentum. Is protectionism, is deglobalization, is a restriction to trade in goods, in services, in the migration of labor, migration of capital, technology, data, information. There is a real form of nationalism of economic policy. Every country wants to protect their own workers, their own firms, and therefore we are deglobalizing, we're becoming protectionist, we're becoming inward, we have a fragmentation of the global economy, we have globalization of supply chains, and we have also the big decoupling, of course, between US and China with the trade and the technology war. that is occurring. So we live in a world in which this deglobalization is a negative supply shock. Because in the last decade, why inflation was low in spite of strong growth of jobs? Because we had globalization and technology. But if now we're going to have less technological innovation because of a tech war between US and China and a backlash against technology, and we have less globalization because we worry that globalization increases inequality, yeah, we reduce inequality, but then we're going to reduce potential growth, we're going to increase the cost of production, and we end up again with stagflation, recession, and inflation. That's the risk of deglobalization.
One of the surprises for me during this pandemic, I would have thought that a pandemic, after a multi-decade period of globalization and international coordination, including the last few decades increasing around an existential human crisis like climate change, I would have thought that our response to COVID would have been one of the most global and international that of all the scenarios, I think would have been more likely. Now, what you ended up seeing was very much a national approach and a nationalist approach, and even that creating ripple effects, as we've seen with the medical sector, with countries now saying, you know, they must have local supply, local security, and local innovation, local technology. Again, we can observe it's happening, but it definitely was a surprise, at least to me, that an issue like this, which was the definition of affecting everyone equally and the definition of spreading across borders, that we didn't handle it that way.
You're right. You know, you need global governance and provision of global goods when there is a global externality. And what a bigger global externality than a global pandemic. But the responses were totally national from the beginning of how can I acquire the mask and PPE for myself rather than sharing it globally, to medical devices, to now the vaccine nationalism, to the national responses of, okay, I'm going to block borders because the foreigners can bring diseases, but, you know, my own people can bring diseases abroad. So restricting movements of labor and people doesn't necessarily improve things because, you know, your people can be sicker than those that are in other countries. So we've had totally inward-oriented national solutions to a global problem. And that has been exactly the negative response that's made actually more nationalism. Actually, we say this is the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. We blame it on China. And we say the workers from Mexico, we have to close the border because they're going to bring the diseases. So it becomes an excuse for becoming even more insular and having Fortress America and having Buy America and Hire America and keep the bad
and it's
people
happening
out of
everywhere.
America, right?
So you talked quite a bit about this before, but about this rise of populism. But the rise of populism has also morphed into a kind of anti-democracy movement, or at least not movement, rise. And the arguments that people are going to have about why democracy should be maintained in the face of economic distress that you predict for this coming decade, what would be the argument that one could make to the middle class or blue collar workers about the advantages of democracy when they are making that judgment no longer based on a kind of political nationalism, but an economic nationalism?
Well, there are two questions. One is the positive and the other normative. The positive is why there is a rise of populism of the right or the left. And the normative is a populist regime better than a truly democratic one? Or is there any argument for authoritarian regimes? That is more of a normative answer. On the positive, as I said, you know, you have economic and financial crisis. You have trade, technology, globalization, disrupting jobs, income, firms, sectors. You have a stagnation of incomes. You have rise in income and wealth inequality, and people become mad. Now, if you are socially and religiously conservative, then you vote for extreme right, kind of populist. And the manifestation of them are Trump in the US, or Boris Johnson in the UK, or Salvini in Italy, or Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban in Hungary, or, you know, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Duterte in the Philippines. If instead you are socially and politically, how to say, not conservative but liberal, then you vote in US for AOC, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and there are similar types of parties that are populist parties of the left in Europe, in advanced economies, in emerging markets, and so on. Even if historically economic crisis led to more strength of the populism of the right, because whenever there is this economic malaise, you're blaming the foreigners, you're blaming the Jews, you're blaming stuff that has to do with conservative kind of political leanings rather than leftist ones, and so on. So the manifestation of economic and financial weaknesses and crises is populism. You're saying the elites are running, they don't deliver the goods, they're leading to crisis, they lead to inequality. Let me go for a strong leader, whether of the right or the left. And you have economic populism. Let's tax the rich, let's tax the elite, let's redistribute, let's do something like this. But the reality is that many of the populist leaders of the right, they come to power pretending to be populist, but since they're representing themselves the economic and financial elites, then they become economically actually very right-wing, you know? Like, you know, the Nazis came to power as being social democrats, but once in power, they were doing the bidding of the Prussian business and financial elites. Mussolini came into power by claiming to be a national socialist, but when they came in power, he destroyed the working class and the unions and became a right-wing fascist supporting the high end of the bourgeoisie. And Trump came to power pretending to care about the lives and the jobs of the white blue collars. So he ran as a populist, but when he came to power, being a Gilded Age kind of billionaire, he ran as a plutocrat. And anything to do by cutting the taxes for the wealthy and the corporates, to trying to destroy Obamacare, to going after workers' rights and unions, destroyed actually the economic benefits of the working class that voted for him. So he was not a populist, he was a plutopopulist. He was a plutocrat wearing the sheep clothes of a populist, like many of these right-wing populists are. They pretend to be populist, but once in power, they do the bidding of the elites. This was Mussolini, this was Hitler, this was Trump. So that means the following thing. On the normative side, it's not true even that these populists are doing what's right for the working class. They pretend to be, and they are not doing it. Secondly, the history of populism suggests, and we have many examples from Latin America and the populist leader of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that just, you know, running large budget deficit, printing money, pretending that you are socially progressive, but you don't have a plan for economic development and reform, eventually populism leads to economic bankruptcy. So whether it's populism of the right or populism of the left, this is not the solution to our economic problem, first. Secondly, on liberal democracy, yes, in crisis, yes, is not ideal. Yes, there is division. Yes, there is gridlock. Yes, the elites maybe have too much power. But as Churchill said, liberal democracy is the worst political system apart from the alternative. And if the alternative is communism and socialism, it failed in China and in Russia until they change. And if the alternative is some authoritarian populist party and regime of the right or the left, that leads also to economic disaster over time. So we don't like democracy. We need to reform democracy. We have problems with democracy, but the alternatives of either authoritarian regime of right or left or socialism as communism has been proven for the last 7,500 years as being a failure. So we have to reform capitalism, but we have to reform it. We cannot destroy it because the alternative of liberal democracy, market-oriented economy is even worse.
So now that's a great segue to our next topic, which is the duopolistic rivalry between the US and China. One of the things that we've seen in history is whichever superpower is the dominant superpower eventually begins to affect the political systems of the vassal states to that superpower. So we now have a situation with a non-liberal democracy as a rising superpower competing with the US and its allies, trying to recruit everyone over to its side. Talk a little bit about this world of this split world between US and China. How will it play out this decade?
Well, historically, what has happened throughout history is what historians refer to as a Thucydides trap. Thucydides was the great historian they wrote the history of rising Athens, a new power facing Sparta, the existing power. And the two-city tribes refer to the fact that historically, whenever you have a rising power facing an existing power, war eventually occurs. And Graham Allison, who wrote the book about the two-city trap, will US and China avoid it, shows that for the last 600 years, in 16 episodes of a rising power, in 12 out of these 16, the rise of that power has led to a war, not just a cold war, a hot war. And the latest example where, of course, there was the rise of Germany before World War I that led to a conflict with the continental powers of France, UK, and Russia, World War I. And the second example was the rise again of Germany and of Japan facing the United States, and that led to World War II. So the last two major global wars have been a result of this two-city trap. Now,
you see a way out?
Well, you know, a success story of avoiding war was the Cold War between US and Soviet Union. But the difference was that the Soviet Union was a failing economic and political system. So it imploded from within, and therefore was no rivalry eventually. With the Cold War and containment, we were able to have a gradual collapse of the Soviet Union and of the Iron Curtain and of his own empire. The difference between the Soviet Union and China is that China is a rising power, economically very successful as opposed to the Soviet Union, and also political and geopolitical now becoming stronger rather than becoming weaker. So there is already a two-city trap between US and China. There's a Cold War between US and China. The Cold War between US and China is becoming colder. It's on trade, on technology, on foreign direct investment, on exchange of people, on data and information. So we'll have this decoupling. But there are also the geopolitical tensions, East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on. And people already start to say, is it going to just remain a colder war, or eventually this colder war is going to end up into a hot war? Because rising power of China, US doesn't want to give hegemony in Asia, conflict can ensue. Certainly, we're not going to avoid the Cold War. Certainly, the Cold War is going to become colder. Certainly, we're going to have a tech war. Certainly, we'll have a split net. Certainly, we'll have a division. Our AI, their AI. Our 5G, their 5G, and so on any technology of the future. The question is the collision course leading to an actual war? We cannot rule it out. And history suggests that unless the rival is a weakening power like the Soviet Union, eventually conflict ensues. And it's not just US and China, but US and China are representing also two systems. China has a bunch of other countries that are his own implicit allies that are also strategic rivals of US and the West, where revisionist power were challenging US power. One is Russia, the other one is Iran, and the other is North Korea. So you have four countries, the most important one being China, but having an implicit, if not an explicit now, alliance with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And you have four major powers that are challenging the economic, social, political, and geopolitical system of the Pax Americana that was set after World War II with NATO, with the United Nations, with the European Union, and with all the institutions like the Bretton Woods institution of the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. Chinese want a new global order that is not based on the United States, and they're going to increasingly challenge. And since the US is divided, since the US is gridlocked, since the US is fighting each other, Democrat and Republican, we're weakening each other. We have lost our soft power by electing Trump, and then for China as a chance of emerging and displacing the United States. The 19th century was the British Empire and the Pax Britannica. The 20th century was the American Empire and the Pax Americana. The 21st century might be the Chinese century and the imposition of the Chinese political economic system on the world. But unlike us, China is not a liberal democracy and is an economic system of state capitalism. So both their economic and their political system is very different from the West and even the one of many emerging markets. So we'll be comfortable with China imposing its own economic and political regime on the world. And what will be the consequences of a China with an authoritarian state, with a surveillance state dominating, increasing a good chunk of the world? What's the risk of that? Are we willing to accept it? It's an open question.
So It certainly is. On the subject of war, you say that we're right now in a Cold War with our with China, but you could say that we're in a Cold War with all four of those
Yeah,
challenges that you said. And the way that I would argue that in the 21st century context, that cyber warfare, digital warfare, is a hot war.
yeah.
It has consequences way beyond the typical Cold War where you can thaw it with détente and so on. Do you think we're now in a hot cyber war with our with the United States? Is the world witnessing already a hot cyber war? And is that going to continue and exacerbate? And is there anything else that could give advantage to one side or the other, or that could get us out of that trap?
Well, that's again my next disruption, number 9, that I call it the digital rivalries leading to cyber warfare. In the past, warfare was either conventional, like, using conventional weapons, or became, of course, with the development of nuclear weapon, also unconventional. But now mutual assured destruction suggests that a nuclear confrontation between great power is unlikely because it's going to destroy the world and have a nuclear winter. But what happened is the following thing. The strategic rivals of the US don't have the spending and the military power to challenge the US power conventionally or even unconventionally. Say US has 11 aircraft carrier systems. China has barely one. Russia has barely one. So if you are someone who cannot challenge you conventionally, what can you do? The Chinese approach, that is also the one that they're using, is of asymmetric warfare. Suppose I can weaken my enemy from within. Suppose that the enemy is a democracy, but is a gridlock divided democracy. And then I can use cyber to do misinformation, disinformation, deep fake, spread conspiracy, so that the gridlock and divided America weakens itself from within. Then if we're fighting each other, we'll have less power to face our enemies abroad. Our soft power is weakened, our hard power is weakened, and therefore the strategy of an enemy that is conventionally weaker than you is using asymmetric warfare, weaken your enemy from within, and what use cyber warfare along many dimensions to try to weaken your enemy. And that's exactly what has been happening with what Russia has done, Iran has done, North Korea has done, and China increasingly is going to be doing it. So the wars of the future are not conventional, they're not even unconventional, but they're related to cyber, where even a small power like North Korea or Iran can cause a lot of damage by making a significant modest investment into cyber warfare. To build rockets, a nuclear weapon takes hundreds of billions of dollars. To have an aircraft fighter system costs you hundreds of billions of dollars. A small investment of a couple of $1 billion into cyber can actually give you lots of results, like disrupting your financial system or your critical supplies or your infrastructures. So it's a cheap way for weaker power to actually cause a lot of damage to bigger power.
And
so in that
context,
not only we have digital rivalries, but then the big tech firms, because there is all debate about whether the big tech firms in the US have too much power. Yes, they have too much power, but solutions like breaking them up may not work because China is using its own big tech firms, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, as a tool of foreign policy, as a tool of surveillance, as a tool of e-commerce dominance of the world. So in this world in which big tech firms can help us to fight cyber warfare, they can help us to fight misinformation. If you split them and divide them, even if there is an economic argument, and you have giant tech firms in China, you're weakening yourself. And therefore, in this world, like in China, the big tech firms become part of the national security industrial complex. Whether we like it or not, the Googles and Amazon of the world will have to help us to build offensive and defensive cyber warfare capability. They'll have to help us in the Pentagon and NSA and the CIA to combat misinformation. So whether you like it or not, and Google and Silicon Valley is very wary of being involved in national security, I don't think there is an option. They're going to become part formally of the national security industrial complex, the same way in which the big manufacturers in the 50s, as Eisenhower said, were part, the Boeings of the world and Lockheed of the world were part of the national military industrial complex. There's a new national security military industrial complex, but rather than being industry, is tech related. So we'll have a repeat of the same thing. So the big tech firms are going to be part of this system. And of course, that implies less privacy, more of a surveillance society, even in the West. We blame China for becoming big brother surveillance society, but gradually, creepingly, these national security needs imply that even in democracies, gradually we're going to limit privacy, we're limiting freedom, and we're using big tech firms as a form of a control society. So the difference between us and China become less relevant than they seem today. That's an unfortunate consequence of these digital rivalries and of the rise of cyber warfare as the most important form of warfare in the future. We become like China, creepingly. And we are already becoming like China. In China is the government, today is the Googles and Amazons and Apples and Facebook of the world who control all your data and they control what you think and how you think and what you do. So Big Brother is watching you. In China is the government. In the case of the US is the FANGs, as we know, right? Yeah. They're controlling and they're monitoring you and they're affecting how you think, how you decide, what you want, what you spend, what you do. They're very, very powerful.
So laying aside these very compelling, despair-inducing previous 9 on your list, even if all of those problems went away tomorrow, we would have these existential crises of deadly man-made disasters, or man-exacerbated disasters, like climate change and pandemics. So what is your view on these existential, man-made or man-exacerbated crises for the coming decade?
Well, I call them, first of all, man-made disaster, or you can say man-exacerbated, because calling them natural disasters when there's a hurricane, a flooding, and fire is nonsensical. It's global climate change that is driven by actions of humans that are leading to a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to global climate change. So it's a man-made disaster. And as we see, the frequency and virulence of extreme weather events is already today becoming significant. On one side, major hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, water, and you name it. On the other side, droughts and famines and fires and desertification. So both extremes, too hot and too cold, too wet and too dry, have to do, as we know, with global climate change. And it's a problem today. It's not just that 40 years from now we'll be underwater. These extreme weather phenomena are becoming more frequent, more virulent, more costly, more damaging by any standard. So the costs are already today, first observation. Secondly, even pandemics are not, again, a natural disaster, because pandemics are effectively zoonotic diseases that have been transferred from animal to humans. And scientists that have studied them and have seen that are becoming more frequent. Again, in the last 30 years, we had first HIV, then SARS, then MERS, then swine flu, then bird flu, then Zika, then Ebola, now COVID-19, and soon enough there might be COVID-20 or 21 or 22. Why these things are happening and more virulent and more frequent? Because before that we had what? 1918 Spanish flu, and then a minor pandemic in 1958. They're becoming more frequent because as we destroy our planet and we're destroying animal ecosystem, wild animals like bats or pangolins that are carrying some of these viruses are getting more frequently in contact either with livestock or with humans. And then you have a transmission of these diseases and pathogens from wild animals to livestock and livestock to human, or directly through wet markets from livestock to humans. And therefore, even the global pandemic is not a natural disaster. Zoonotic diseases are actually highly correlated with global climate change and the destruction of animal ecosystems that makes them closer to livestock and humans. So there are studies already showing this very strong link. So both of them are man-made disasters. They're not natural disasters.
Just to close off with this 10th, and then I want to ask you two more hopeful questions to wrap up. There's an estimated cost to keep global warming down to the level that it would require to not have, maybe we've already passed it, but possibly not have runaway ecological disaster. The estimates are that it would cost $2 trillion every year of expense to mitigate sufficiently the climate change crisis. Given what you said economically about the other issues and the costs, and given the existential nature of the climate change crisis, which would exacerbate all the others, are we sufficiently, even though we are devoting a lot of attention, of course, are we sufficiently prioritizing the urgency and the scale of the environmental crisis right now and making necessary global and national fiscal plans to coordinate that kind of strategy at that scale?
Well, the answer is we're not. You know, even the Paris Accord kind of goals, 1.5 to 2 centigrade Celsius, look right now as mission impossible. We're already well behind the curve. And the problem is these agreements are voluntary. There's no enforcement, and there's a free riding problem. If I'm a small country and I do everything to achieve net zero emission, nobody else does it. I'm still polluted like everybody else, and I pay the cost. So there's a coordination, there's a tragedy of the common thing. And politically, accepting much lower growth, because there is going to be a lower growth cost, in spite of talking about the green economy. How much is the lower growth cost? We don't know, but it's tricky, but there will be one. And of course, the China and India of the world, they say, yes, we're not polluting more than US and Europe, but you guys have been polluting for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, and you became rich, and now you say, let's keep the environment and the air clean, but we're poor and want to become rich, and now you want to impose on us and inflicting the pain of no growth and job creation and income because you want to keep the planet clean. So again, there is also an intergenerational conflict and an inter-country conflict that implies that these things are going nowhere. So if you ask any scientist, they tell you mitigation, that means to try to achieve 1.5 to 2 is mission impossible unless we completely change everything tomorrow. And even under Biden, even under the new plans of EU or Japan, we're not going to be able to reduce the increase in the temperature to only 1.5 to 2. It's impossible. It's not going to happen unless there is a revolution and we decide to have very low growth. This politically not acceptable in emerging markets, is not acceptable in US and Europe. What's the other solution? People say, well, if you cannot keep the temperature from rising, is adaptation. We make sure that we don't get all flooded and things of that sort. But adaptation may be as costly, if not more costly than mitigation. And I'll give you just 2 examples. We know that Manhattan, where I live, New York, is going to be underwater in the next 30 years or so. So there were 2 plans. One was to build a wall all around Manhattan, but it's ugly, it's expensive, and you don't see even the water. It's like being in a prison, right? Then they say, well, if you don't want to do that, let's have these levees near the Verrazzano Bridge so that the water rising is not going to flood Manhattan. That plan cost $125 billion. Who's going to pay for it? Federal government, local citizens, nobody's going to pay for it. And we don't know whether it's going to work. And even if you prevent Manhattan from being flooded, the water has to go somewhere. So it's going to flood New Jersey and Long Island, right? So we're pushing the problem to somebody else. And that's just one Manhattan, let alone thousands of miles of coastline on the East Coast, on the West Coast. Or take another example. Jakarta is sinking underwater, capital of Indonesia, 12 million people. The government decided to move the entire capital to another location. How much is going to cost them? Hundreds of billions of dollars. Where are they going to do it? Where is the money? So mitigation is costly and is not working. Adaptation, that means that we're going to then adapt to rising temperature and avoid being flooded and burning down, is as expensive and it's not going to work. And then there's the third option of geoengineering, kind of, how to say, space cadet solution. Like we're going to throw in the higher atmosphere some dust. It's going to reflect the sunshine, and it's going to prevent the temperature from heating up. That is something that looks like freak science. One, we don't know whether it's going to work. We don't know how expensive it's going to be. And we don't know what are the consequences of trying to be essentially like having a big umbrella of a dust kind of cloud in the upper atmosphere to prevent heating from occurring. So whether you're doing mitigation or adaptation or geoengineering, each one of these things is expensive. Most of them may not work. And therefore, we want to achieve a goal of not destroying the planet. It's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. The economic costs, the fiscal costs, the growth costs are huge. Let's be realistic about it. We need to do something, because otherwise we're going to have a destruction of the planet. But the inertia might be that actually destruction of the planet is going to be the de facto slow motion train wreck we're facing right now. And once we try to do something about it, there may be non-linear effects. That's going to be too late, because then extreme events occur that imply we cannot reverse them. Like maybe if a major ice sheet were to collapse in the water, either in Greenland or in Antarctica, you could have a rise of 8 feet of sea levels globally, not in a matter of 50 years, in a matter of 4 months. And some scientists are worrying that these cracks in the ice sheets in Greenland and in Antarctica may imply such an extreme event occurring sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't know, but the probability of something happening in 5 years as opposed to 50 years gradually. One thing is the sea level gradually rising. If there is a crack and this thing fall in the water, will be underwater in Manhattan 6 months from now. That's how scary it is. And we're maybe at the point of no return.
All of these issues are clearly extremely intimidating, and you make very compelling arguments about why most of them are in motion or already occurring or inevitable, and of the scale of the impact, and also the interrelatedness of all of them. If, as a thought experiment, if you were to describe the world of the 2030s, not the 2020s, and we got through these issues, what might that world look like on the other side to you from an optimistic perspective?
Well, in the book, I speak about these 10 deadly Ds and disruption that can imperil our future, but I'm not gloomy and saying nothing can be done about it. For each one of them, there are proposals and solutions. Each one of these proposals and solutions has some costs and some benefits. They're not a free lunch. We'll have to make sacrifices. And I cannot summarize right now all of them. And for example, whether UBI becomes feasible, not today, but in a world where technology allows the economic pie to become much bigger. And therefore being able to afford it, something we cannot do right now. So things that are not affordable today may be affordable 10 or 20 years from now, given technology. I would say that the world can go in two directions. These 10 deadly threats can lead us to really destroying ourselves and the planet and our economy and our societies, and having a nuclear winter and cyber warfare and nuclear conflagration and other disruptive things. We could have a repeat of the 1930s, only worse, a greater depression. That's one road, a fork in the road. If we address each one of these things, that requires the right policy domestically, but many of these things are global problems: climate change, pandemic, financial crisis, demographics, duopolistic strategic rivalry, deglobalization. All these things require common solutions that are of global governance. But how we create institutions of global governance that are having democratic legitimacy? Even at the domestic level, the parties and the rulers are not as legitimate because they're seen as being distant from their rule. What if we have a global governance? How we justify it? And so on and so on. So my argument is that each one of these things is not simple. Each one of the solutions has cost. There's not a magic bullet. We can do it, but it requires domestic cooperation of different parts of society and global coordination, cooperation, and global governance, even among rivals. Even US and China have many things that they share as common externalities. And either we resolve them together or we're going to destroy each other. Resolving these things is not going to be easy. And therefore, the risk that actually we take the path that leads to destruction and depression, as opposed to reconstruction and global governance and resolve this problem, is a rising risk.
I think I'm going to not ask my final question because I think you've answered it. I think that's a great way to wrap up. This was an extremely comprehensive view of the current state of the world. You've made a great case for, unfortunately, for all of your points. And you've done a great job to kick off this series, as we'll have other deep and influential thinkers like yourself in this series for others who want to participate. I thank the audience as well for taking the time to watch this. And again, I thank you for your devotion and intense energy to focus on these issues on behalf of the rest of us. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
See you soon. It was a great pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.